So I'm really happy to introduce Dr. Eileen McGinnis, who is a graduate of Columbia University, and she's currently teaching English at St. Edward's University here in town. I met her through our Science Communicators program that I founded here in Austin with science journalist Lindsay Patterson a couple of years ago. We have monthly happy hours, and the next one's coming up. I'm just plugging everything. All right. The next one's coming up here on October 28th. If you like to talk about science, communicating science, come and join us for that. It's free. You're welcome to join us for that. But I met Eileen through that a couple of weeks ago and found out that she is currently researching a book about Ada Lovelace, and I was fascinated. It was perfect timing for this show because here's Ada right here, one of Ellie Willoughby's prints. And so I was just fascinated to learn more about this woman whose story is often told through the very famous men in her life. And Eileen is going to tell us more about her. Help me welcome Dr. Eileen McGinnis.
So Ada Lovelace, I would argue, is having a moment. Or it might be more accurate to say she's having multiple kinds of moments in the culture. Some of them inspiring, some of them just quirky and weird, and some of them downright undignified, in my opinion at least. Right now, awkward.
Stand it right down here. Make sure. Turn it off. There we go.
So on the inspiring end of the spectrum, of course, there's Ada Lovelace Day, which Kelly also already told you a little bit about, in which Lovelace functions as this kind of touchstone, this rallying point for telling stories about women's contribution to the sciences. She's also figured prominently in steampunk, both the literary genre, as well as just like the material culture, the aesthetic of steampunk, such as, for example, this Ada Lovelace collection, corset and shoulder harness that was on Etsy a few years ago. She's appeared on t-shirts, in fan art. She's even been played by the incomparable Tilda Swinton. And this is the part I'm a little indignant about. She's also been used to sell women's underwear, not women. So I think this raises the question, for me anyway, of why now? What is it about this present moment that makes her so compelling to us? You know, this woman who lived in the first half of the 19th century, what does she have to say to us today? And if you think about Virginia Woolf's idea of mothers to think back through, you know, how do we use Lovelace to think through questions about women's role in tech, or about our kind of complicated 21st century relationships with computers? So I think that's a really interesting question, but I'm actually not going to answer it today. I thought that many of you might just be curious to know more about Lovelace, you know, who she is, you know, what she did. So that's really going to be the focus of my talk. But I think that it's hard to tell her story without, at least for me, as a literary critic, without sort of looking critically at kind of how her story has been told, who's gotten to tell her story, what kinds of perspectives, biases, assumptions are built into the stories that we tell about her. And as Haley also briefly alluded to, I promise this is not suddenly a digression about that 80s sitcom with Paul Reiser, but I actually think My Two Dads is a really useful way of thinking about how Ada's story typically is told, which is basically as kind of an addendum or a footnote to one of two father figures in her life. So, of course, there's her biological father, the mad, bad, and dangerous to know, Lord Byron, late romantic poet. Ada's mother separated from Byron when she was about a month old, and they had a very kind of messy and public separation. So Lovelace has certainly been kind of embroiled in all of the Byron drama. And then there's her surrogate father of sorts, the mathematician and inventor Charles Babbage, who was a lifelong friend of Lovelace's. She referred to him in letters as the old Bab. Babbage was kind of a tinkerer and was involved in many inventions and ideas, but he's She's probably best known today as the inventor of the Analytical Engine, a general programmable computer. There's a fan here. Which really, in a lot of major respects, kind of anticipated the 20th century computer, including its use of punch cards. Another variation of the My Two Dads theme is to see Lovelace as this kind of passive embodiment or synthesis of these two father figures, this marriage of art and imagination on the one hand and science and progress on the other. And what I want to suggest is not that these men weren't important in her life, even though she didn't know Byron. Obviously he was this kind of looming presence or absence for her. And her collaboration with Babbage was really kind of crucial. But I think it's more interesting to think about how Lovelace herself thought about these men, how she used them in really kind of strategic ways to tell her story and to articulate her ambitions for herself as a scientist. I also think that if you get rid of the patriarchal dudes in her life, that we actually get to see some of the women who also influenced her. One of them was Mary Somerville, who was a self-taught but very well-respected scientist. One of the first women, along with Caroline Herschel, to be elected to the Royal Astronomical Society. And Somerville was Ada's mathematical correspondent. She would chaperone her to different scientific lectures around London. And she was also just incredibly well-connected and could provide Lovelace with access to a really rich group of fellow scientists and scholars. Then, of course, there's the more controversial figure of Lovelace's mother, Lady Byron, who I think the historians are pretty much have reached a consensus that she was not a likable lady. She's kind of a difficult person. But that said, I think it is important to acknowledge that throughout Lovelace's life, she really did support her. She supported her mathematical pursuits. For example, Lovelace, at one point, one of Lovelace's tutors writes to her and says, your daughter's brilliant, but due to her delicate female condition, I don't think she should continue pursuing math intensely. And Lady Byron's response is basically, my daughter lives for math. It's essential to her happiness, and so essentially bugger off. There's also this really lovely note that Lovelace writes to her mother in around 1841 when Lady Byron is about to embark on a trip to Paris. And she asks her, while she's in Paris, to inform her of all the news, quote, curious, mysterious, marvelous, electrical, to be my wonder and mystery hunter. And I feel like that quote kind of shows that, at least at times, they had this kind of playful relationship and really kind of shared and supported each other in their kind of intellectual pursuits. So what I've tried to argue so far is that the stories we tell about Lovelace can emphasize or de-emphasize certain figures that were really influential in her early development. But I think the stories we tell, the frames we apply, can also affect how we ultimately assess Lovelace's contribution today. Before I go there, though, I just want to tell you a little bit about what she did. She's probably best known today for a series of explanatory notes that she published in Taylor's Scientific Memoirs in 1843. She had done this translation of work in French about Babbage's engine, and then she also ended up adding her own notes that extended about 3 times the length of the article. And these notes were both, they both contained technical details, but they also really speculated about the potential for this machine and what it could do. They were designed in part to drum up business for Babbage, to garner government support for his machine. So you might be thinking, okay, well, so she has one publication, basically that's sort of where her credentials rest, and it's not even a publication about an invention that she created. It's about some other person's creation. And so that's certainly been, I think, one take on Lovelace, is to say, really, if we look beneath the myth-making around her, there's really not much to it. She really didn't do that much. Bruce Collier, for example, who wrote a Harvard dissertation about Babbage's engines, refers to her as the most overrated woman, or the most overrated figure in the history of computing. I think more intriguingly, though, Dorothy Stein, who was a computer scientist, wrote a full-length biography of Lovelace, and at the end of her research, basically was disappointed about what she found. She found her to be not that kind of intellectually sophisticated. She was really disappointed that Lovelace hadn't contributed original research. And she actually ends her biography with this sentence: "We can only be touched and awed by the questing spirit that induced her to launch so slight a craft upon such deep waters." Which I feel like is pretty cold. I mean, you've just written a biography about someone and basically say, there's really not much to this person. So I think that people who kind of look to Lovelace for original contributions to mathematics have been disappointed. She was certainly an avid student of math, but I think we need to kind of find another place to rest our assessment of Lovelace. On the flip side, of course, we have people who praise her as the world's first computer programmer. And this is based on one of her explanatory notes about Babbage's engine, which included a sample algorithm. I think that it's understandable that we want to try to make sense of her in terms that are familiar to us today. But I think that doing so kind of risks not just anachronism, but putting her reputation on kind of shaky ground. Some people have said, well, Babbage and his assistants wrote this algorithm years ago. And even if that wasn't totally the case, Babbage and Lovelace collaborated really closely on these notes. So can we really give her full credit for writing this program? And I think that leads to headlines like this one from the Eponymous a few years ago, which reads, "Ada Lovelace Day. Right idea, wrong woman, ? So there has been some questioning of whether Lovelace is really kind of the best person for us to use as this kind of figurehead for celebrating women's contribution to science. So because I'm here today talking to you about Lovelace, I think that there is something of substance that Lovelace did contribute. So I want to tell you a little bit about my own assessment of where I think Lovelace's contributions lie. And I mean, they don't necessarily lend themselves to a catchy tagline like world's first computer programmer, but I want to suggest that they are more kind of important and far-reaching contributions. So first up, as I mentioned earlier, Lovelace and Babbage collaborated really closely on the notes on his analytical engine, and that was a two-way exchange. Babbage really kind of gained insight and knowledge from his correspondence with Lovelace. Lovelace, it's been argued, had a much more kind of expansive vision for the potential of Babbage's machine than Babbage himself. Babbage was still sort of stuck in thinking about this machine as kind of a number cruncher, whereas Lovelace was really the one to be able to make that conceptual leap to thinking about it as a machine capable of symbolic manipulation. She also kind of speculated, for example, about its ability to be used to compose music. She even kind of raised the question of machine intelligence in her notes, which is pretty remarkable. Again, thinking about this as just a theoretical machine. And particularly that question of machine intelligence influenced Alan Turing, computer pioneer, father of AI. He referred to Lovelace in a very influential paper of his in 1950. So I think this points to a second contribution of Lovelace, which is that even though there's not a direct line of descent from Babbage's engines to the early history of computing, that we can see figures like Turing actually reading Lovelace, being interested by the questions she's raising 100 years earlier. So she is in indirect ways kind of influencing that early culture and mythos of computing. The other point I'm going to argue in favor of Lovelace's contribution is that she was unabashedly and unapologetically ambitious for herself as a scientist. And this brings us back to her relationship with Babbage. Lovelace was very strategic and deliberate and active in seeking out a collaboration with Babbage. As early as the 1840, 1841, she would be writing him letters saying, if you ever want my mind to be used in the service of your machine, I'm happy to oblige. So she was not modest. So she repeatedly made offers to collaborate with Babbage. And when their partnership hit a rocky point, she also wrote him this very kind of assertive letter where she says, if you want to collaborate with me in the future, you're going to have to do it following these terms. So I think this is a really important way that Lovelace can continue to be a model for women in science, for women in the professions, that she was so kind of unapologetically ambitious and so confident in what she had to offer. And then finally, this is what I think is the most kind of important contribution that Lovelace can make today, even though it's one that often is overlooked in the story that we tell about Lovelace. Lovelace coined this term in one of her letters to her mother, this idea of poetical science, and she doesn't really define it, she just sort of mentions it in passing. But I think that if we look to her relationship with her father and her kind of assessment of her father's legacy, we can get at what she might have meant by this idea of poetical science. And this is actually in a letter that she wrote to Charles Babbage. She writes, "I do not believe my father was, or ever could have been, such a poet as I shall be an analyst. For with me, the two go together indissolubly." So for Lovelace, doing science, for her, was sort of inextricable from the imaginative, from the creative act. She didn't see these as sort of separate realms at all. What's interesting to me is that Lovelace's mother, Lady Byron, had often used mathematics. She saw it as a way to kind of clamp down on the Byronic passions that might have been lurking in her daughter. But for Lovelace, as an adult, thinking about her father's legacy, she really kind of argued that creativity, imagination, passion were at the heart of what it meant for her to do science. And I think that this idea of poetical science and Lovelace's practice of the poetical science is really what allowed her ultimately to understand Babbage's analytical engine. Keep in mind that most people this time just didn't have a context, didn't know how to make sense of this machine, and Lovelace was one of the few who did. And I think it's what allowed her not only to understand the machine and its technical aspects, but also to really imagine possibilities for the machine that went beyond the imaginings of its inventor. So I think this is really what Lovelace has to contribute to us today. A lot of our assessment of Lovelace's legacy is kind of backward-looking, even to call her the world's first computer programmer. A lot of our questions about Lovelace have been, what might have been if the computer was invented in the 19th century. That's certainly what a lot of science fiction that deals with this topic is about. But I want to argue today that if we look to Lovelace's own writing about poetical science and her own practice of science in her life, that she actually has something very forward-looking to teach us. That this idea of poetical science as a kind of linking of the imaginative and the analytical realms can be kind of a really relevant future path for us, both as individuals in our own lives and also as a culture. So that's my talk. Before I wrap up though, so I think Lovelace is worthy of study, worthy of celebrating an Ada Lovelace Day, but LeVar Burton style, you do not have to take my word for it. So here are a few further resources for further reading. If you go nowhere else, you should definitely check out the webcomic 2D Goggles. Yes, some fans already. It is very fun and funny comic about Lovelace and Charles Babbage, their inventors fighting crime in Victorian England with the Analytical Engine. But she also is kind of obsessed with Lovelace, and she offers just tons of primary documents. So it can be a very kind of superficial and fun read, or it could be something that you could just go down the rabbit hole with and spend forever playing around on there. Also, my friend who's a children's librarian and is here today kind of recommends reading biographies written for children and teens as, well, in part just being shorter, but also kind of really engaging and accessible. So I'm actually going to recommend the young adult biography of Lovelace. I think it's really fair and even-handed. It takes about an hour to read. Unfortunately, it is out of print, so it might require a little work to track down, but I know it's available for cheap on Amazon and the like. And then finally, if you do want a book written for adults, I highly recommend Betty Toole's collection of Lovelace letters. This is actually available in the Boston Public Library, I believe. What I like about this is that it works really well as a biography of Lovelace. She does a good job of giving you that context. But you also, and I think this is really important, you get a sense of Lovelace's voice. She's a really kind of engaging and charming person that I think you're going to fall for if you read some of her letters. So if you're interested in kind of going beyond some of the myths and to use the poet Sandra Cisneros' term, like the myth and bullshit around Lovelace, and really kind of getting access to Lovelace herself and her own voice, then I totally recommend this collection of her letters. All right, so that's it for me. Does anyone have
time for questions?
How is her last name Lovelace?
Her husband was the Countess, the Earl of Lovelace.
Okay.
She became the Countess. Yeah.
How do we... I'm thinking back to the work of a lot of female scientists who kind of got the scoop by their PI, so to speak. I'm thinking maybe specifically of Jocelyn Bell, who's behind you, whose PI got the Nobel Prize for her work, basically. How do we know that a lot of what Babbage wrote wasn't really written by her? Or is there a way to know?
That's a really great question. I mean, there is their correspondence is pretty kind of well documented, and so you can definitely see them working kind of collaboratively on the notes. So I think there is a lot of documentation. There is a lot of evidence that this wasn't just sort of Lovelace taking dictation for Babbage. That she was a really kind of active contributor in creating these notes. Although they do tend to get talked about, I think, in some of the literature as just Babbage, as sort of like an insight into Babbage's mind at the time, in a way that doesn't really create a space for understanding how Lovelace contributed as well.
It seems like she died somewhat young. What happened there?
She did. She actually died just short of her 37th birthday, so actually the same age as Byron. And she had a really long and awful struggle with cervical cancer at the end of her life. So, I mean, that's sort of the other tragic part of her story, is that she was really ambitious for herself beyond just her collaboration with Babbage. She writes at one point about wanting to write a calculus of the nervous system and kind of put, organic processes into mathematical law. But unfortunately, her illnesses interfered with that goal.
What was her educational background? Like, it seems like her mother was very motivated in opening up that world to her, and Byron's presumably
was not in the picture, yeah.
Right, was not in the picture. Okay. But it's like she has this really powerful, exploratory, creative mind, and is that all her, or is that a product of, what exposure did she have?
That's a great question. So, she was educated by a series of private tutors growing up, and I would say on the earlier end of that, her mother did have a lot of direct control. And I wasn't kidding when I said that her mother really did kind of see math as a way to kind of, regulate some of her sort of more passionate qualities. But she also engaged kind of later in life in kind of correspondence courses, including with some very well-known mathematicians like Augustus de Morgan. Also with Mary Somerville, they would correspond about those questions. So it was ultimately, I think, an education that encouraged her to explore and to pursue independent thinking.